Hey, Sven here. Maybe you've noticed when setting up webhooks in Make That for some time now, there's this API key authentication option. And maybe you wondered or asked yourself how you could secure your scenarios for different users using your own API keys in some way. And that's not exactly trivial. To do that, you need to understand this one sentence here. Send the API key using the xmake API key HTTP header. And what that's all about and how you can secure your scenarios against unauthorized use, I'll show you here in this video. I'm Sven, an entrepreneur, and I've been working with quality and process optimization for over 34 years. Not just in business, but in all areas of life. And a lot of what I can do today, I've learned through experience, through trial and error, and I know what really works. And in my videos, I want to show you how you can use intelligent process automation profitably for yourself and your business. And if you're not quite sure where to start, or you just have specific questions, then just book a free call with me. You'll find the link down below this video. So let's get started. Yes, so webhooks. Webhooks triggering a scenario from an external source. And what would be kind of cool is if you could secure your scenario so that only authorized users can access it. And for that, you can use API keys, basically some secret keys that you give to someone. And then they can use the API key. And you want to make sure that only someone with a valid API key then can access it. And that's why it's really important to take another careful look at this. I'll delete this first and let's go into the documentation here. A custom webhook module, that's exactly that red thing there. And here it says optional. Add API key authentication. That means I can add an API key here, give it a name, and then an API key value for this API key. And then you can see here as well, a maximum of 512 characters. And you might know these API keys, they can sometimes be really long. So, and now there's a really crucial sentence which you could already read in the headline. If you attached API keys to your webhook, make sure you provide the API keys in the xmake API key header in your request. So that means when calling the webhook, this API key has to be included, right? And specifically in the header of the request. But now we have the problem that we can't actually use this header at all if we just call it like this. That means, for example, if we specifically want to call this particular webhook right now, I've already called it call with API key for clarity and identification, and we have successfully set up a functional webhook here within our system. I will then proceed to go ahead and click on the edit button to make further modifications. And now I've just added two users here. User 1, user 2. If I add a third user here, click add, then for example, I'll call them user 4. And the API key value can be anything. Of course, you have to leave it visible at first so that I can pass it on to the user, because after that it will never be visible again. And then I click on create, and then the fourth user is now authenticated here. And if a user who, for example, pays you a monthly subscription for the application stops paying or cancels, you can simply delete them here. And then they automatically no longer have access. So far, so good. So that means you can equip a webhook with these API keys. These keys then end up here in the key management section of Make. You can see that in this keys menu item here. And these are, for example, right here. These are user 1 and user 2 that I entered. But if I edit them now, the API key value is no longer visible anywhere. And of course, I saved it somewhere and can continue to use it now. So at least this path is pretty well secured now. But now the question is, how do I actually call this webhook? And I can only do that by proceeding as follows. I've made a little diagram for this. So we've set the whole thing up in two stages. We have a central webhook that can be called in the usual way. That means the user calls a webhook and then provides their API key via a regular link, API key along with it. And this main webhook, in turn, uses the webhook to then call the secure scenario. And this secure scenario first checks the API key. If the user is, of course, able to make a real HTTP request with a header, then that's not a problem. But if they can only call a link, meaning just this regular webhook link, then they can't include the header there. That's why we need this two-step solution. And well, if the user is accepted, then the scenario is executed. And if not, well, then access is prevented anyway by the 401 response. So here I have this main scenario where I have a regular webhook that receives the call from outside via a normal URL and the API key. This API key is then passed to the secured scenario using the HTTP module. So now I've simply called the webhook here, and for testing purposes, I'll also pass along the username that I received from this external call. For testing purposes, I'm also including the username, which I got from this external call. And now here's the crucial point. I need to add the header here, specifically this XMake API key. And now I can insert the API key there. That means it will be passed as a header call to the sub-scenario. This sub-scenario then automatically checks internally whether the API key matches, and if it does, the scenario is executed. And if not, a 401 is returned, just as I've shown here, as I've already demonstrated. Yes, and that's exactly how it works in the complete process now. That means we'll just start this subordinate scenario now. We'll start the main scenario. And then here in an Airtable, I've simply entered 3 users. And you might remember we created users 1 and 2 in the keys in make with the API key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and user 3 doesn't exist. That means if I now call up the first user here, the system has run through. You can see it also went into the success path back here. So what did we get here now? The API key 1, 2, 3, the name user 1. We then made the request here and received a 200 as a response. And that's why status code 200. And then I simply set a variable here and said, okay, success, yes. And now, depending on that, I could do something here in the sub scenario, which also ran through successfully. Now I just get some data here that I actually can't do anything with. That means it was simply checked internally whether the API key is valid. And then I just set a variable back here. It's called hello message, hello user1, because user1 was passed here as a parameter. So yes, and basically that's it already. That means as a counterexample, if I start both again, if I now take user 3 here as a counterexample, then we can clearly see that this particular request went into a definite failure state, primarily because it ultimately received a 401 unauthorized status as a direct response. And so, as you can observe here, data unauthorized and status code 401. And these are the data I provided. And yes, so we have our scenario, which we want to protect against unauthorized access, secured here with the API key. We made a request that was successful. We made a request that was not successful. And this construct, that's exactly it, which I drew here in this little diagram. The user calls from outside, that was Airtable, calls the main webhook, and the main webhook calls the secure scenario. And if that's okay, then it works. Otherwise, it simply doesn't go any further. So maybe you can make good use of this for your scenarios, especially if you charge money for it or if you want to make sure that only certain people can access it. And I wish you lots of fun with it. Until next time, ciao.